You know they're not good for you. You've known it for a while, maybe since the beginning. There was a part of you, even early on, that registered the warning signs, the inconsistency, the hot and cold, the way you felt more anxious around them than you felt calm, the specific, quiet knowledge that this was not going to be easy. And you stayed anyway, or you left and came back, or you ended it and found yourself thinking about them constantly, or you moved on to someone new who turned out to have the same quality, that particular undefinable pull that the healthy, available, consistently kind people in your life somehow never produced. You are not stupid. You know what's good for you in most areas of life. But in this one, in the specific domain of who you are drawn to, who you can't stop thinking about, who you give your time and energy and emotional investment to, despite all evidence that the return will be insufficient, something else is running the show. Here's what that something else actually is. It is not bad judgment. It is not self-destructive personality. It is not some character flaw that means you are incapable of choosing well. It is a set of specific, documented neurological processes in your dopamine system, in your attachment circuitry, in the part of your brain that learned, long before you were old enough to make conscious choices, what love was supposed to feel like. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why you are drawn to people who aren't good for you. The neuroscience of intermittent reinforcement, the psychology of attachment wounds, and why the person who feels like the right one so often turns out to be a very precise echo of something old. There is a principle in behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. It was first documented systematically by B.F. Skinner in his work on operant conditioning in the 1950s and 1960s. Skinner was studying how reward schedules affect the persistence of behavior in rats. He found something counterintuitive. Behavior that is rewarded every time it occurs is relatively easy to extinguish. When the reward stops, the behavior stops fairly quickly. Behavior that is rewarded unpredictably, sometimes not always, on no discernible pattern, is extraordinarily resistant to extinction. The animal keeps doing the behavior long after the reward has stopped coming. The variable reward schedule produces the most persistent behavior, not the consistent one, the inconsistent one, and the reason is dopamine. Your dopamine system, the brain's primary motivation and reward circuit, does not fire most intensely when a reward is received. It fires most intensely when a reward is anticipated but uncertain. The possibility of reward, not the certainty, is what maximizes dopamine release. This is why slot machines are more addictive than predictable games. Why checking your phone produces a compulsive quality that reading a book does not. Why the almost is often more gripping than the yes. The person who is inconsistent with you, who is warm sometimes and distant other times, who gives you exactly what you need occasionally and nothing at all at other times, who keeps you never quite sure where you stand, is, neurologically, running a variable reward schedule on your dopamine system. Not deliberately, usually. But the effect is identical to what Skinner documented in his lab. The unpredictability produces compulsive engagement. The inconsistency produces attachment that is stronger, not weaker, than consistent warmth would generate. The wanting becomes more intense, not less, with every cycle of connection and withdrawal. You are not addicted to them. You are addicted to the possibility of them. And the dopamine system, optimized for pursuing uncertain rewards, cannot easily distinguish between a slot machine and a person who is intermittently warm. Here is where it gets more specific. Because not everyone is equally susceptible to the pull of intermittently reinforcing people. Some people are more vulnerable to this pattern than others. And the research on why is remarkably consistent. The people most drawn to inconsistent partners are typically people whose earliest experiences of love and closeness were themselves inconsistent. This is the core finding of decades of attachment research, beginning with John Bowlby's work in the 1950s and extended by Mary Ainsworth's landmark studies in the 1970s. Ainsworth developed an experimental procedure called the strange situation, designed to observe how infants responded to separation from and reunion with their primary caregiver. From these observations, she identified distinct attachment patterns. Secure attachment in children whose caregivers were consistently responsive, and two primary forms of insecure attachment: anxious attachment in children whose caregivers were inconsistently responsive. Children with anxious attachment, whose caregivers were sometimes warm and available and sometimes not, with no clear pattern the child could predict, developed a specific relationship with intimacy. They craved connection intensely. They were hypervigilant to signs of disconnection. They were not calmed by closeness, because the experience of closeness had taught them that closeness could be withdrawn. They were not relaxed in love. They were alert in it. And here is the finding that explains the adult pattern. These children, grown into adults, did not seek out consistent, predictable partners and find them comfortable. They often found consistent partners boring, or suffocating, or somehow not quite right in a way they struggled to articulate. What felt like love, what produced the specific, heightened, recognizable feeling of attachment, was the feeling they had learned in childhood as what closeness feels like. Which was not comfort. It was vigilance, anticipation, the specific emotional state of wanting someone and being unsure of having them. The uncertain partner doesn't just activate the dopamine system through intermittent reinforcement. They feel like home. Because home, for an anxiously attached person, was always uncertain. There is a term in psychoanalytic and trauma literature for this phenomenon. Repetition compulsion. First described by Sigmund Freud in 1920, the concept refers to the unconscious tendency to recreate early relational dynamics, even painful ones, in adult relationships. Not because the person consciously wants to suffer, not because they are attracted to pain for its own sake, but because the brain, in its attempt to master what was never resolved, keeps returning to the same emotional territory. The child who could never quite secure the consistent love of an unavailable parent did not give up wanting it. The wanting went underground, became the emotional template against which adult relationships would be measured. And in adulthood, when a person with that emotional template meets someone who reproduces the same dynamic, who offers closeness without certainty, warmth without reliability, the possibility of love that is always slightly out of reach, the old longing activates. This is the one. This is the feeling I've been looking for. Not because the feeling is good, because it is familiar. And the brain, navigating the vast complexity of human connection, uses familiarity as a primary guide. Research by Helen Fisher at Rutgers University on the neuroscience of romantic love has found that the early stages of intense romantic attachment activate the same neural regions as cocaine addiction: the caudate nucleus, the ventral tegmental area, regions dense with dopamine receptors, producing the focused, goal-directed, almost manic quality of early intense attraction. For people with a history of anxious attachment, the person who reproduces the childhood dynamic of uncertain love activates this system most powerfully. The anxiety itself, the not knowing, the wondering, the monitoring for signs of whether they care, produces the neurological signature of intense attraction. The consistent person who calls when they say they will, who is warm without being withdrawn, who does not make you wonder where you stand, does not activate this system with the same intensity. Not because they are less lovable, because they are too predictable to keep the dopamine system in its highest state of pursuit. Here is the piece that most people have not been told. The attraction to people who aren't good for you is not a preference for being treated badly. It is a preference for a specific feeling state. And the feeling state was learned. In her work on trauma and the body, Bessel van der Kolk at Boston University has documented a phenomenon he calls traumatic reenactment. the way people with histories of relational trauma unconsciously recreate the emotional conditions of their original wounds, not the specific circumstances, the emotional texture, the specific feeling of being desperately wanted and then withdrawn from, of trying harder and not quite getting there, of love that requires performance to earn rather than safety to receive. That emotional texture, encoded in the nervous system during formative years, became the template against which adult love is measured. And anything that diverges significantly from that template feels wrong. Not bad. Wrong. Like something is missing. Like the chemistry isn't there. The chemistry that is perceived to be absent is the chemistry of anxiety. The specific neurological cocktail of dopamine anticipation, cortisol uncertainty, and the particular heightened aliveness of a nervous system that is monitoring a relationship for signs of safety or danger. That cocktail, in a brain that learned love under those conditions, has been misidentified as passion. And the calm, secure, genuinely available person produces none of it. They feel safe. And safe to a nervous system that learned to equate love with uncertainty feels like the absence of something essential. So what does the research say actually interrupts this pattern? Not simply choosing better. The pattern is not primarily at the level of conscious choice. It runs underneath conscious choice in the nervous system's learned associations between specific emotional states and the concept of love. Interrupting it requires something more fundamental than deciding to date differently. The first thing the research points to is recognition, not intellectual recognition, but visceral recognition. Learning to identify the specific feeling state that the anxious attraction produces in the body, and to recognize it as a trauma response rather than a compatibility signal. The elevated heart rate, the hypervigilance, the obsessive quality of thinking about the person, the specific way that uncertainty about them feels like intensity. These are not signs of chemistry, they are signs of an activated attachment wound, and recognizing them as such, in the moment, when the pull is strongest, creates the first small gap between the feeling and the automatic response to it. The second thing the research points to is tolerating the discomfort of security. Research by Amir Levine and Rachel Heller, drawing on attachment science, has documented that people with anxious attachment who enter relationships with consistently available, secure partners initially experience discomfort. The absence of the familiar anxiety. The inability to locate the monitoring task, because there is nothing to monitor. The specific strangeness of feeling held without needing to earn it. That discomfort is real, and it often gets misread as a sign that the relationship is wrong. It is not a sign that the relationship is wrong. It is a sign that the nervous system is in unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory for a system calibrated to a specific emotional environment takes time to accept as safe. The third is the one that most reliably produces lasting change. Therapeutic relationship. Not necessarily formal therapy, though often that, but the experience of a consistently available, genuinely responsive relational presence, a therapist, a mentor, a deeply secure friendship that provides, over time, the accumulated evidence that closeness without uncertainty is possible, that love without anxiety is not a deficit, that being held without having to earn it is not boring, that the feeling of safety is not the absence of passion. It is what passion feels like when it is not entangled with fear. You know they're not good for you. That's where we started. And now you know why you stayed anyway. The dopamine system, running its pursuit of uncertain reward. The attachment wound, encoding the familiar emotional texture of love as something that requires monitoring, performance, and the management of uncertainty. The repetition compulsion, sending you back to the emotional territory where the original longing lives. None of that is a character flaw. All of it is a nervous system doing what nervous systems do, navigating the present through the lens of the past, using the emotional templates it was given to identify what love is supposed to feel like. The past it was given was not your fault, and the pattern it produced is not a life sentence. But it does not change through insight alone. It changes through experience, new experience, of a different kind of closeness, of what it actually feels like when someone is genuinely, reliably, uncomplicated there. That experience does not immediately feel like the right thing. It often feels like the wrong thing, for exactly the reasons this video described. But with enough repetition, enough accumulated evidence that safety is not absence, that calm is not indifference, that available is not boring, the nervous system begins to revise its template. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. And the person who once only felt the pull of what hurt them begins, over time, to feel something different. The specific, quieter, more sustainable feeling of being loved by someone who is actually good at it. It does not arrive like lightning. It arrives like morning, gradually, then all at once. If the science behind why you feel what you feel matters to you, the real research explained without the noise, subscribe. No judgment about who you've chosen or who you've stayed with, just the psychology and neuroscience that actually holds up, and what it means for how you navigate connection. The next video goes into why people who have been hurt the most often become the most guarded, and what the research says about how that wall actually gets built and whether it can come down. Hit subscribe. That one is worth staying for. There is a specific experiment from neuroscience that makes the dopamine mechanism of this addiction viscerally clear. In 2010, a research team led by Helen used fMRI to scan the brains of people who had recently been rejected by a romantic partner, people who described themselves as still in love with the person who had left them. They were shown photographs of the person who had rejected them and photographs of neutral acquaintances, alternating, while the scanner tracked their neural activity. The results were striking. Viewing the photograph of the rejected partner activated the ventral tegmental area and the caudate nucleus, the same dopamine-dense regions that activate during the early stages of intense romantic love. Not the regions associated with grief or sadness, though those activated too. The regions associated with reward motivation, with wanting, with the directed, urgent pursuit of something the brain has categorized as essential. Being rejected by someone you love does not extinguish the brain's pursuit system. It activates it. The loss of the reward, the withdrawal of the person, produces not the cooling of desire, but its intensification. The dopamine system, running on the variable reward schedule that the relationship has established, responds to the withdrawal of the reward by increasing the motivation to pursue it. This is why rejection so often makes people want someone more rather than less. Not because the person became more desirable when they left, because the dopamine system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, responding to the removal of an uncertain reward with heightened pursuit. And for someone with an anxious attachment history, someone whose template for love includes the anticipation of withdrawal, the monitoring of availability, the specific vigilance of someone who has learned that love can disappear, this neurological response is not a new experience. It is the familiar one, the one that has always felt like love. Which is why ending the relationship, even when you know it is the right decision, does not automatically reduce the pull. The decision is made in the prefrontal cortex. The pull is running in the dopamine system. And those two systems do not always agree. And the dopamine system is older, faster, and louder than the prefrontal cortex in most circumstances. What helps is not overriding the dopamine system through willpower. It is reducing the opportunities for it to be activated. Contact that is limited or absent gives the reward pathway fewer opportunities to fire in pursuit. Over time, weeks, months, sometimes longer, the pathway that has been associating this specific person with the uncertain reward begins, without reinforcement, to weaken. Not immediately, not comfortably, but genuinely. The same neuroplasticity that allowed the addiction to form allows it to dissolve, given sufficient time and sufficient distance from the stimulus that was sustaining it. There is one more finding that completes this picture, and it concerns the question that most people who recognize this pattern in themselves eventually ask: if I know all of this, if I understand the dopamine mechanism, the attachment wound, the repetition compulsion, why does the pull still feel so strong the next time? The answer is that understanding and feeling are processed by different systems. The intellectual knowledge that a person is not good for you is held in the prefrontal cortex. The pull toward them is running in the limbic system, in the emotional memory networks that learned their associations before language, before the capacity for this kind of analysis, before you were old enough to choose. Those systems do not share information automatically. Understanding does not transfer cleanly into feeling. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a description of why the work of changing this pattern is experiential rather than cognitive. You cannot think your way out of it. You can experience your way out of it, through the accumulated practice of noticing the pull without following it, through enough exposure to what security actually feels like, that the nervous system begins to recognize it as something to move toward rather than away from. Through relationships, therapeutic, friendly, romantic, that provide consistent enough safety that the template of what closeness feels like begins, slowly, to revise. That revision is one of the most difficult things a nervous system can do. It requires updating a model of love that was built in childhood, reinforced across years of adult experience, encoded in the limbic system at a level of depth that rational understanding barely touches. It is slow. It is non-linear. It often involves periods of going back to the old pattern before the new one holds. But the brain that learned what love felt like in one environment can learn what it feels like in another. Not as a theory, as a lived, embodied, neurologically real experience. The kind that doesn't just know that security is possible. The kind that finally, after all of it, feels it. That is what the research is pointing toward. Not a better choice made once. A different nervous system, built over time, through enough safe experience that the word love stops being associated with the feeling of uncertainty, and starts being associated with the feeling of being held, fully, reliably, without the monitoring, without the earning, without the specific, exhausting vigilance of someone who has learned that love requires performance to sustain. Just held, by someone who stays, not because of what you do for them, because of who you are. That is what this entire pattern has been looking for. It has just been looking in the wrong places, because those were the only places it knew to look.